The professor of economics at the London School of Economics, editor of Econometrica and president of the European Economic Association. She's a world-leading expert on labor markets in developing countries. Early today, she gave a keynote lecture here at the FAIR Midway conference in the north of Norway on jobs and poverty in developing countries. Welcome to Coffee with Oriana Bandiera. Welcome to FAIR, and a very interesting talk early today, Oriana.
Thank you.
What was the talk all about for the audience?
So in this talk, I spoke about jobs and the process of development and how jobs relate to poverty and how actually poverty, the reduction of poverty, can make a country grow. And I presented a new database that we put together for public use, which puts together all the available censuses and DHS for every low and middle income country in the world, which is made free available for all researchers who are interested in the study of labor in economic development. So then I went on, starting at the very, very bottom of the income distribution. I went to the poorest villages in the poorest areas of northern Bangladesh, where we studied the jobs that women in these villages do. And we saw that there is very little variety in jobs. There is about 2 or 3 things that they can do, which is work as a maid or as a rural casual worker or take care of cows, rear livestock. And normally the richer women in these villages rear cows and the poorer women work as maids. And the question is, do the poorer women work as maids because they have no ability to rear cows, or do they just work as maids because they can't afford a cow? So I told about this experiment which we ran in these villages and how the experiment allowed us to detect a poverty trap in jobs. That is, the fact that the poor women were perfectly able to do the job of the rich women, but by being poor, they couldn't afford the necessary amount to buy the cow. And we saw that we could actually identify the classic poverty trap diagram and identify the threshold past which, if you bring people past that threshold, they can escape poverty for good. So that was one example in which labor was misallocated. That is, all these women in these villages could have done the more productive job, but they couldn't afford to.
So I call for, let's say, microfinance programs or savings groups to
So it's very
capital.
interesting that you mention microfinance, because microfinance is exactly that, is micro. It gives very little. And if you calibrate the amount of the loans for microfinance among the population that we study, you would be 1/10 of the way to the threshold. Okay. So that's why microfinance is not enough.
More a big push kind of
We need a
strategy?
big push approach. Exactly. It's a big problem. It needs a big solution. So it needs.
It's quite controversial, of course. The big push idea it's theoretically very appealing, and I understand your thinking. But what evidence is there out there for this big push idea to be effective?
In this particular setting, quite a lot of evidence, because we follow the same group of women for 11 years. And we see how the group which passes the threshold keeps investing and keeps growing. So by the 11-year mark, they have more than doubled their stock of assets. And they are definitely escaping poverty on their own. So these are people who will never need a transfer ever again. Those who didn't pass the threshold went back pretty much at the level that they started with. So in this particular setting, there is clearly evidence in favor of a big push. And it's not, the big push seems scary because it's big, so it's a lot of money. But if you sum up all the small pushes that you need to give throughout the life of a poor household without ever allowing them to escape poverty, I think that many small pushes put together are actually more expensive.
And I guess in this case, it was perhaps giving the money for a cow, but I guess the one challenge with the big push is that you don't know exactly what to push in some sense. There can be so many constraints So it's not a
Of
matter
course.
of just like a one-dimension thing, but you need to increase, I don't know, education, and you have the credit and so on.
You can
and so-
give cash. It would be, I mean, in this setting, it was an asset, but cash would be equally good. And actually, we calibrated that the amount that you need for the big push is 1 year worth of income for a poor household. And if you look at the cost of, say, community college in the US and relate that to the, say, the median income, it almost matches that. So if you think that the big push in a place like the US would be sending kids to college,
Right.
1 year worth of income would do that.
But a big injection of cash to women, I guess, in this case,
Yes.
that can unleash some household dynamics which are not always to the advantage of the woman. I suppose that can be there are risks involved in that strategy as well.
No, of course. In this particular sample, the women were either widows or didn't have an able man in the household that could work. So the
Okay.
sample, because it was targeted to the poorest of the poor, and typically the poorest of the
okay.
poor tend to be, female-headed
So you
households.
think the dynamics may be different if we're talking about households where there's a husband present?
I wouldn't say so. I don't have reasons to think that. But if the cash, for instance, is conditional on education, if you give a subsidy to college, then it doesn't matter whether you give it to the man or the woman because it's conditional on the son or daughter going to college.
Super interesting, rather provocative as well, I should say, in some sense, but super interesting. And what made you interested in this topic of well, jobs and poverty? A huge issue, of course, but.
Well, as I mentioned in the talk, the word poverty comes from pauper and from the Latin small production. That is, the poor is somebody who produces little. And coming from the poorest part of a very rich country, you always wonder why it is. Because the people around you all look the same. And they have the same ambitions, and they have the same interests, and they have access to the same technology. So why is that one place is poor and the other one is not? And I think it's the allocation of people to jobs plays a very important role in that.
It's the fundamental question of economics, basically, and
Exactly.
and the fundamental mystery of economics.
Exactly.
Why some countries are rich and poor. To viewers of this conversation, maybe PhD students who are interested in this fundamental question of poverty, what advice would you give in terms of important research topics, that given what you know and all your expertise over the years?
So I think that for a PhD student, the best advice is to research what you love, because the question will be with you for many, many years. And so you can only find a good answer to a question that you want to know the answer to. So I don't think it's a matter of finding a specific question suggested by me, but rather to find something that you're genuinely interested in. And that is the luxury of doing research.
And is there a question that you love in particular that you're going to spend time on in the next year or 2 or 3? What's your favorite project at the time for the time?
My favorite project is always my last project, right?
Okay.
So I briefly spoke about this too during the lecture. Is this idea of measuring development through the creation of new occupations. So we see this empirical regularity that as countries grow, there are more jobs, in a sense there are more diverse jobs. And what I argued in the lecture is that having these diverse jobs allows a better match of people's preferences and talents with the jobs. So the finer you split the jobs, the more efficient the allocation. And so I'm going to study this further because I think that this could be one reason why countries, rather than individuals, get stuck in a poverty trap.
And is there any way that the governments or I don't know, donors can speed up this process of job diversity?
Yeah, this is very interesting because I'm in another project in parallel, I'm studying what happened in Korea. If you see in the 70s, South Korea and Nigeria looked identical in terms of poverty, and they were hobbling along the same trend. And then all of a sudden, Korea took off. And within 30 years is nothing. If you think about it, somebody aged 40 in 2000, he was 30, so he was 10 when his country was like Nigeria, and by the age of 40, he's in South Korea. It's quite
mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing. And so we're studying what happened in South Korea. And it was basically a mix so far, as far as we understand, a mix of policies that favor coordination and favor demand to get to the firms. Because for firms to be created and for firms to grow, there has to be demand for their products. And it's a coordination. This is a Rosenstein-Rodan model. It's a coordination issue because there will be demand for shoes if there are enough people working, and there will be demand for food if there are enough people working, but there won't be, you can't open just a shoe factory and hope that the population spends their entire income in shoes. So facilitating that coordination is really the job of the government. So provision of infrastructure, roads,
A big push
trains,
at the macro level.
at the infrastructure level. I think those things that the private sector does not provide.
Yeah, fascinating talking to you, and we look forward to the next chance to meet you at FAIR.
Thank you. Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.